The New York Times, from April 8, 1853, announced that there was some concern felt about the fate of the Independence. Quote, "There was much anxiety felt for the safety of the Vanderbilt steamship Independence, from which nothing had been heard, though she was 30 days beyond her time. She had a large number of passengers on board. She was to have connected with the steamship Northern Light from New York, January 20th, and was last seen on the 15th of February off Cape St. Lucas. Hopes were entertained that she had put into some intermediate port. The steamer Seabird has gone in search of her."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story Fire and Flood on the Independence?
Here we are. Enjoy!
It took time for news to reach New York from California, and by the time the New York Times was expressing its fears about the fate of the Independence, San Francisco had already learned what had happened to the missing ship. There was certainly good reason to be concerned about what had happened to the overdue ship. Vanderbilt's Nicaragua line had lost 2 ships the year before that had been traveling down the California coast, and now the start of 1853 did not seem to be bringing any better luck. The Independence had been a trailblazer for Vanderbilt's Nicaragua line. Built in New York in 1849 specifically for the line, the Independence had been the first of the fleet to carry passengers from San Francisco to Nicaragua so that they could pass across the Atlantic via the San Juan River, and there make connections to New York. The Independence would be the smallest ship of the fleet of what would grow into 10 ships by 1853, coming in at only 900 tons, but it was still in demand on the popular route. There was certainly no shortage of passengers and cargo to travel to and from California in the middle of the California Gold Rush. On the 4th of February, 1853, the Independence departed from San Juan del Sud, bound for San Francisco on a routine voyage. In total, she had 356 passengers on board, as well as 62 crew members under the command of Captain Sampson. The first week and a half of the voyage was uneventful, and one passenger would write that the mood on board among the passengers was cheerful. She made a stop in Acapulco, and then passed St. Lucas on the morning of the 15th. At 2 a.m. on the 16th, they could see Margarita Island, and Captain Sampson, who spent the entire night on the deck, ordered that the course be changed with the intention of passing 3 miles from the southern point of the island. Captain Sampson said that, though it was agreed that it was a perfectly calm and clear night, as it had been every day during the voyage, there was a haze over the land. It would be this haze that Captain Sampson would blame when, at 5:30 in the morning, the ship struck on a reef off the southern point of Margarita Island. It turned out that they were much closer to the land than the 3 miles that he had thought. He would also say that the reef that they had struck had not been on any chart he had ever seen. Dawn was just starting to break, but it was still dark enough that the land of Margarita Island was hardly visible. The Independence had been going under full steam when she struck, and all of the passengers on board, though they had mostly been asleep, were immediately aware of what had occurred and rushed to the deck in confusion and panic. Captain Sampson remained in the wheelhouse and ordered the ship backed off the reef, which was easily done. Since the collision had not seemed particularly violent, and the ship had backed off easily, there might have been some hope that the damage was not too bad. But when Captain Sampson ordered that the pumps be sounded, it was found that there was 8 feet of water in the hold. Knowing that the ship would soon be in danger of sinking, Captain Sampson tried to keep the situation hidden from the passengers to prevent panic, while directing the Independence towards the nearest land to beach her. Unfortunately, the passengers almost immediately learned of the true situation, and there was a panicked rush back to the cabins for valuables, during which some people were injured. The panic proved to be premature, and the passengers eventually mostly calmed down. The crew of the Independence had sprung into action. The coal had gotten flooded when the ship had taken on water, so they had loaded as much wood as they could from parts of the passenger staterooms into the furnaces, so that they could keep the ship traveling at full speed to find a safe place where they could beach the vessel. A sail was pulled over the bow to try to slow the rush of water, and men were put at each hatchway to bail. Captain Sampson, meanwhile, was struggling to find a safe place to beach the Independence. As dawn broke and the people on the Independence could see where they were more clearly, they found that they were traveling along a coast filled with huge rocks and cliffs, which offered no welcoming beach. It was only after they had traveled about 5 miles by one passenger's estimation that they were able to find a small sandy beach, and the ship was directed towards it. Captain Sampson might have continued the search for a better spot, but the engine crew had just come up and told him that, with how the water was rising, it would only be a few minutes before the engine fires were put out. The passengers, worried about the coming impact, crowded the stern of the ship, and made it difficult for the man at the helm to steer the ship. But the maneuver was successful, and the beaching of the Independence could only be considered a success. Unfortunately, the loading of the furnaces with as much fuel as possible would now come back to haunt those on board. The rising water blocked the flues and chimneys on the Independence, and with the pressure building inside the furnaces coming to a head, the furnace doors burst open, shooting flames into the engine room and driving the engine crew out of the room with intense heat. The engine crew tried to put out the fire for a short period of time, but the woodwork had caught, and the fire spread incredibly rapidly. The passengers, unaware of the drama that was unfolding in the engine room, were meanwhile being organized to evacuate the ship. The passengers who had crowded the bows of the ship now crowded the bow, eager to be as close as possible to land. The land was about 300 yards away from where they had grounded, but even though the weather was calm, waves crashed on the shore, making it somewhat unwelcoming. Captain Sampson ordered the first mate to take a line to the shore in one of the boats to make the evacuation easier, but the boat was swamped by the surf as it got close to the shore. All of the men in the boat were able to reach the shore, but the line they had been carrying was lost. Some of the firemen who had been driven from the engine room by the fire now stepped forward and volunteered to make the next attempt, and a second boat was launched. This time they succeeded, and a line now connected the shore and the ship, but no one seems to have thought to make immediate use of it. The third boat departed from the Independence without making use of the line, containing the ship's doctor and 6 female passengers. Just like the first boat, the third boat was swamped by the surf as it neared the shore. The doctor was able to remain on board, but all of the female passengers were swept into the water. Fortunately, the people who were already on the beach rushed forward and pulled them out of the water, and all of them were saved. Another boat, the only other boat that the ship had to offer, followed close behind them without incident. The first mate had also taken the boat that had delivered the line to shore back to the side of the ship, and this too was loaded with women and children. Just as the female passengers from the third boat were being pulled from the water, the quarterdeck of the Independence burst into flames. The panic among the passengers was immediate. People jumped into the sea at first because of the fear of the fire, and soon after, to escape the fire that was rapidly spreading. When it reached the stern of the ship, the 2 cannons that the Independence had were set off, adding to the chaos and noise with their loud salute. Captain Sampson, seeing people who could not swim struggling in the water, ordered that anything that could be thrown overboard as a means of flotation be thrown. Soon, the water was filled with spars, hatches, and tables. People began to struggle towards the shore, where people who had been able to reach the shore before them waited to pull them to safety. It was found that the surf made it far too difficult to have boats travel from the shore back to the ship frequently. They were repeatedly washed back onto the beach when the attempt was made, though they did manage the occasional trip. The current swept past the stern of the Independence and out to sea, which did not help, because it caught even some people who were considered good swimmers and took them out to sea where they were lost. Some of the people who were clinging to the things that the crew of the Independence had thrown overboard as flotation devices shared their fate, even with less of a chance to escape the current, since they were not able to swim at all. Throughout, the engine crew in particular distinguished themselves as heroes. The fate of the children on board the ship was of particular concern, and members of the crew began to tie children to themselves before jumping into the water. On a couple of occasions, it cost both the crew member and the child they were attempting to rescue their lives. Still, others were saved thanks to the efforts of the crew. One fireman brought 2 children to shore who had lost both of their parents. Another fireman brought to shore a boy and placed him in his mother's arms, only to find that the woman had just lost her husband and 2 of her children, and had believed that she was the only survivor of her family. It was an incredibly emotional reunion. Out of all of the firemen who stepped up, though, the one who distinguished himself the most was a 19-year-old named Tom Sawyer. He had a reputation for being rough around the edges, but as the New York Times commented, his faults would be forgotten after his bravery was put on full display. He stripped and swam to the wreck 3 times to carry people to shore. After the 3rd trip, he was exhausted but learned that the chief engineer was unable to swim and was still on the ship, so he set out again with a life preserver and, with the chief engineer on the life preserver, towed him to shore. Out of all of the life-saving efforts made by the crew, Tom Sawyer was estimated to have saved the most. Later in life, he would become a drinking buddy with a journalist who wrote under the name of Mark Twain, and Mark Twain would pay tribute to his friend by naming his main character after him. An hour after the ship had gone aground, the entirety of the Independence was a mass of flames. Only 2 men were left on the ship, Captain Sampson and a coal passer named Beaumont. Captain Sampson would say that 2 of the deckhands managed to get a boat from the shore alongside the ship, and the 2 men jumped from the deck of the ship and reached the boat, but one of the passengers would say that it was a passenger who had managed to launch the boat, not members of the crew. They then got to work picking up other people from the water and taking them to shore. Another boat under the command of Heron, the ship's steward, was successfully launched from the shore and joined them. On shore, Captain Sampson oversaw the turning of a large sail that had washed ashore into a shelter for the women and children. He then gave orders for any remains that washed ashore to be buried, and for the crew to board the wreck as soon as they could, once the fire was no longer as dangerous, to see if any supplies could be salvaged. Captain Sampson, meanwhile, took a boat with a few men and went in search of other ships, which he hoped to find on the north end of the island. The next day, they spotted a single schooner named the A. Emery. The crew was taking on water, but when they saw the castaways, they returned to the ship to speak with them. Captain Gordon of the A. Emery knew that his ship had almost no water on board still, but on learning of the plight of the passengers who had been left on the beach, he agreed to take them to San Jose, where they would at least have food and water, since Captain Sampson had some doubts about whether the survivors had even managed to salvage those necessities from the wreck. When Captain Sampson arrived with the A. Emery, where he had left the survivors, however, he found only the mate waiting for him on the shore. While Captain Sampson had been gone, the rest of the survivors had gotten to work trying to survive. Much of the luggage that had been thrown into the sea from the ship had floated out into the open water, carried by the current, and therefore nothing could be expected from that. The Independence burned to the water's edge, and then the hull washed against the rocks where people boarded it and found 15 barrels of salt provisions still intact in the hold. They were brought on shore and would provide food, but it did not solve the difficulty of thirst. 3 members of the group traveled 20 miles up the coast of the island, living on any shellfish they could find, in search of water, but found none. Small holes in the rock near where the wreck had occurred produced about a tablespoon of brackish water every minute, and initially this was the only relief that the over 200 people on the beach had for their thirst. The chief engineer began to build the distillery to turn salt water into drinking water, but that would take time. Some of the prospectors from among the survivors took it upon themselves to wander even further for water. One of them brought back news of more small holes in the rocks on the southern part of the island. Other prospectors who had walked across the island came back with news that there were whaling ships about 15 miles away in Magdalena Bay. The survivors mobilized with fresh hope, and a group of men began to cart one of the cannons from the ship across to where the whale ships had been seen so that they could attract attention. Before the cannon could arrive, though, a group of 30 men had managed to carry one of the ship's boats across the island and rowed it to the whaling ships to tell them what had occurred. Almost as soon as the boat had arrived where the whaling vessels were, a boat set out from one of the ships carrying water and bread for the main group of survivors. As soon as they were refreshed, the entire camp began a march to get to where the whaling ships would be able to pick them up. One woman had given birth to a healthy child in the makeshift camp, and the mother and baby were carried on a stretcher to where help was waiting. 4 whaling vessels were waiting for them in total, and every ship met the survivors with the greatest hospitality and kindness. They had spent 3 miserable days on the island with almost no water, but the ordeal was over. Once Captain Sampson joined them, one of the whaling ships, the Meteor, was chartered to take them to San Francisco. A few passengers chose to take other ships from the whaling fleet to the Sandwich Islands and go from there, but 255 people were crammed into the almost too small Meteor for the voyage. Once they reached San Francisco, the difficult work of figuring out who all had been on the vessel began. The purser had survived, barely, after washing ashore clinging to a spar and needing to be revived by those who pulled him from the water, but none of the ship's papers had survived with him. This meant that there was no passenger list. It would later be estimated that 127 people had been lost in total between the fire and those who had been lost to the sea. The passengers would angrily levy charges of neglect and incompetence against Captain Sampson. Charges were eventually brought against him for manslaughter, but we were not able to find anything coming of the case. Captain Sampson would insist that if the fire had not occurred, every single person on board would have survived, and that they could have brought everyone on shore safely in the boats if they just had the time. Though many condemned Captain Sampson for hitting the reef and then steering them aground in a spot that proved to have a strong surf and current and was surrounded by dangerous rocks, no one could deny that his crew, especially the engine crew, had gone above and beyond to try to save as many lives as possible, especially the later immortalized Tom Sawyer, who would go on to work as a part-time firefighter in San Francisco, continuing to save lives until he retired at the age of 65. For more information, please see the New York Times from April 26, 1853, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.